The pre-dawn darkness over Baghdad on March 20th, 2003, was shattered by the thunderous roar of cruise missiles and the eerie glow of anti-aircraft fire lighting up the skyline. This opening salvo of Operation Iraqi Freedom marked the beginning of what would become one of the most controversial military campaigns in modern history. For months, the world had watched as tensions escalated between the United States and Iraq, with the Bush administration citing intelligence reports that claimed Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. The phrase shock and awe had become synonymous with the strategy of overwhelming force that the U.S. military intended to unleash upon Iraq's government and military infrastructure. In Washington, President George W. Bush announced that coalition forces had commenced operations to disarm Iraq and liberate its people. In reality, the war was about to become a prolonged and deeply divisive conflict that would expose flawed intelligence, ideological fervor, and geopolitical miscalculations that would reshape the Middle East for generations to come. The attack began with an intense aerial bombardment targeting Saddam Hussein's key military installations, command centers, and suspected weapons sites. Tomahawk cruise missiles fired from U.S. warships in the Persian Gulf streaked through the sky, striking strategic targets with precision, while stealth bombers soared over Baghdad, dropping payloads designed to cripple the Iraqi military's ability to resist. Explosions rippled across the city as flames and smoke billowed from government buildings, communication hubs, and military barracks. Meanwhile, the streets of Baghdad, usually bustling with life, were eerily silent as terrified civilians huddled in their homes, listening to the deafening echoes of war. Across the border, thousands of coalition troops were already on the move, surging into Iraq from Kuwait in a coordinated ground invasion. Leading the charge was the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, accompanied by the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force and British forces, pushing northward with lightning speed. Armored columns rumbled across the desert, advancing with little initial resistance as many Iraqi units simply melted away. The Iraqi military, already weakened by years of sanctions and internal strife, proved unable to mount a conventional defense against the technologically superior coalition forces. In many cases, Iraqi soldiers surrendered en masse, abandoning their posts rather than facing the devastating firepower of the advancing invaders. However, Saddam's elite Republican Guard and paramilitary forces put up sporadic resistance, engaging in ambushes and asymmetric warfare tactics that foreshadowed the brutal insurgency that would emerge in the months and years ahead. As coalition forces advanced, capturing key cities such as Basra and Najaf, the psychological warfare campaign intensified. American forces broadcast messages urging Iraqi soldiers to lay down their arms, while reports surfaced that Saddam Hussein had either fled the country or was in hiding. On April 9th, less than 3 weeks after the invasion began, U.S. troops entered the heart of Baghdad. In a symbolic moment broadcast worldwide, a statue of Saddam Hussein in Firdos Square was toppled by American Marines, with jubilant Iraqis cheering and striking the fallen dictator's image with their shoes, an ultimate gesture of disrespect in Arab culture. The world watched as the once powerful regime collapsed, seemingly confirming Washington's belief that victory had been swift and decisive. Yet even as images of celebrating Iraqis filled television screens, ominous signs hinted at the chaos to come. With the fall of Baghdad, the official military campaign appeared to be over, but Iraq was far from stable. Looting and lawlessness spread across the city as government institutions collapsed, and there were no immediate plans in place to restore order. The Iraqi military had been dismantled, and the Ba'ath Party purged, leaving a power vacuum that was quickly filled by sectarian and insurgent elements. Former soldiers, now unemployed and embittered, took up arms against the new U.S.-led occupation. Shia militias, Sunni insurgents, and foreign jihadist groups saw an opportunity to exploit the instability, launching attacks against coalition forces and rival factions. Bombings, Assassinations and ambushes became daily occurrences, turning what was initially a conventional war into a brutal guerrilla conflict. The search for weapons of mass destruction, the primary justification for the war, proved fruitless. By 2004, it was clear that Iraq did not possess the stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons that had been claimed. The revelation that the intelligence used to justify the war had been faulty or exaggerated fueled international condemnation and domestic criticism in the United States. The Bush administration faced mounting scrutiny as the war dragged on, costing thousands of lives and billions of dollars. The initial mission accomplished declaration made by President Bush aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln in May 2003 quickly became a symbol of premature triumphalism as Iraq descended into further violence. The insurgency grew fiercer with each passing year. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by the ruthless Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, orchestrated bombings and executions that targeted U.S. forces, Iraqi security personnel, and civilians alike. Suicide bombings devastated markets, mosques, and police stations, further fracturing Iraq along sectarian lines. The conflict between Shia and Sunni factions escalated into a full-scale civil war, with U.S. troops caught in the middle. The emergence of powerful militias, such as the Mahdi Army and the Badr Brigade, led to violent clashes that turned entire neighborhoods into battlefields. The situation was further complicated by Iran's involvement, as Tehran provided support to Shia factions fighting against both U.S. forces and Sunni insurgents. By 2007, the war had reached a breaking point. The U.S. government, under immense pressure to curb the escalating violence, implemented the surge strategy, deploying an additional 30,000 troops to stabilize key regions. The strategy, coupled with efforts to recruit and arm Sunni tribal fighters against al-Qaeda, temporarily reduced violence, but it did not resolve the deeper political and sectarian divisions plaguing Iraq. Corruption ran rampant in the new Iraqi government, and Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's Shia-led administration alienated Sunni communities, further fueling resentment and extremism. As American troops gradually withdrew under the Obama administration, the fragile peace began to unravel once more. The power vacuum left by departing U.S. forces in 2011 allowed extremist groups to resurface. By 2014, a new threat emerged: the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, a brutal terrorist organization that seized vast swathes of Iraqi territory, including Mosul, and declared a self-proclaimed caliphate. The rise of ISIS, in many ways, was a direct consequence of the policies and miscalculations made during and after the initial invasion. The Iraq War, once envisioned as a swift campaign to bring democracy and stability to the Middle East, instead became a prolonged and costly conflict that reshaped geopolitics and destabilized the region for decades. The toll was immense. Over 4,500 U.S. troops killed, tens of thousands wounded, and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians dead. Trillions of dollars were spent, and the strategic gains for the United States remained questionable at best. Looking back, the Iraq War serves as a cautionary tale of the perils of interventionism, the dangers of intelligence failures, and the unpredictable consequences of regime change. While Saddam Hussein's dictatorship was undoubtedly brutal, the war that removed him unleashed a maelstrom of violence, extremism, and instability that continues to reverberate through the Middle East today. The echoes of 2003 are still felt, proving that wars are rarely won in the moment, but are judged by the legacies they leave behind. The road to war had been paved with questionable intelligence and mounting political pressure. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, the Bush administration shifted its focus toward Iraq, despite no credible evidence linking Saddam Hussein to al-Qaeda or the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Intelligence agencies scrambled to find proof that Saddam's regime was developing weapons of mass destruction, an assertion that would later be discredited, but, at the time, was used as the central justification for military action. The now infamous claim that Iraq had sought yellow cake uranium from Niger, a key component for nuclear weapons, was based on forged documents. Yet it found its way into high-level briefings, shaping the narrative pushed by the White House, the CIA, and the Pentagon. In January 2003, President George W. Bush made his case to the American public during the State of the Union address, stating unequivocally that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction and that he posed a direct threat to global security. The pressure intensified as Secretary of State Colin Powell prepared for a critical moment in the march toward war, his February 5, 2003 presentation before the United Nations Security Council. Standing before world leaders, Powell laid out what he claimed was irrefutable evidence of Iraq's illegal weapons program. He displayed satellite images, played intercepted communications, and described mobile biological weapons labs that, in reality, did not exist. Powell himself harbored doubts about some of the intelligence he was presenting, but the political momentum was unstoppable. Later in life, he would call this speech a blot on his record, a moment of deep regret. Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts to prevent war were unraveling. The U.S. and its closest ally, the United Kingdom, led by Prime Minister Tony Blair, sought international backing for a UN resolution authorizing military force against Iraq. France, Germany, and Russia voiced strong opposition, arguing that weapons inspections should continue and that war was premature. Millions of protesters took to the streets worldwide in one of the largest anti-war demonstrations in history, warning of the consequences of a U.S.-led invasion. Yet, inside the corridors of power in Washington and London, the decision had already been made. The Pentagon finalized invasion plans under the leadership of Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and General Tommy Franks, preparing for a lightning-fast military campaign that would rely on overwhelming firepower and rapid maneuver warfare. The belief was that the Iraqi military would collapse within days and that the people of Iraq would welcome U.S. troops as liberators. By early March 2003, the countdown to war had begun. President Bush issued an ultimatum. Saddam Hussein had 48 hours to leave Iraq or face military action. Few believed Saddam would comply. On the evening of March 19, 2003, as the deadline expired, a last-minute intelligence report suggested that Saddam and his inner circle were gathered in a bunker in Baghdad. Acting on this tip, the U.S. launched a decapitation strike, a barrage of cruise missiles and precision-guided bombs intended to eliminate Iraq's leadership before the war even officially began. The attack failed. Saddam was not in the targeted location, and within hours, the broader invasion was underway. The first phase of the war, codenamed Shock and Awe, was designed to deliver a devastating opening blow to Iraq's military infrastructure. Hundreds of Tomahawk missiles rained down on Baghdad, striking government buildings, military bases, and communications hubs. The night sky was illuminated by fiery explosions as anti-aircraft fire arced upwards in a futile attempt to repel the onslaught. Meanwhile, across the Kuwaiti border, massive columns of U.S. and British ground forces surged forward, beginning their rapid drive toward Baghdad. The invasion force was spearheaded by the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, and British forces advancing toward the southern city of Basra. Resistance in the early days of the war was sporadic. Many Iraqi soldiers simply abandoned their posts, unwilling to fight a technologically superior enemy. The Republican Guard, Saddam's elite military force, put up pockets of resistance, but was quickly overwhelmed by precision airstrikes and coordinated armored assaults. In the south, British forces encountered stiffer resistance in Basra, where Iraqi paramilitary fighters and loyalist militias engaged in fierce urban combat. However, the overall pace of the invasion remained relentless. U.S. forces raced toward the capital, bypassing cities whenever possible to maintain momentum. The speed of the advance took many by surprise, including the Iraqi leadership, who had expected a drawn-out campaign similar to the Gulf War of 1991. On April 9th, just 3 weeks after the invasion began, U.S. troops rolled into central Baghdad. The collapse of Saddam's regime was symbolized by the dramatic toppling of his statue in Firdos Square, an event broadcast live around the world. Jubilant Iraqis cheered as American Marines pulled down the massive bronze figure of the dictator, though in later years, reports would reveal that much of the scene had been orchestrated by U.S. forces for propaganda purposes. The fall of Baghdad was seen as a decisive victory, and many in Washington believed that the war had been won. President Bush, standing aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln on May 1, 2003, declared the end of major combat operations under a banner that read, "Mission accomplished." But the reality on the ground told a different story. While Saddam's government had fallen, Iraq itself was spiraling into chaos. Looting broke out across Baghdad as government institutions crumbled and security forces disappeared. Museums, banks, and ministries were ransacked as desperate civilians and organized criminal gangs took advantage of the lawlessness. The U.S. military, unprepared for the sudden collapse of order, did little to intervene. Worse still, a series of critical decisions made by the U.S.-led Coalition Provisional Authority under Paul Bremer exacerbated the crisis. The complete disbanding of the Iraqi army and the de-Ba'athification policy, which barred former Ba'ath Party members from government positions, left hundreds of thousands of trained soldiers and civil servants unemployed and embittered. Many of these men would later join the ranks of insurgent groups, fueling the violent rebellion against the U.S. occupation. As the months passed, an insurgency took root, growing stronger with each passing day. Attacks on American troops became routine, with roadside bombs, IEDs, and ambushes claiming more lives. The emergence of al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, brought a new level of brutality to the conflict, with suicide bombings targeting both U.S. forces and Iraqi civilians. By 2004, the war had entered a new and far more dangerous phase, one that the Bush administration had not anticipated. The dream of a swift victory had given way to a nightmare of sectarian violence, political instability, and a war that would drag on for years. Looking back, the road to war had been paved with faulty intelligence, political ambition, and a fundamental misunderstanding of Iraq's complex sectarian dynamics. The consequences of the invasion, the rise of ISIS, the prolonged U.S. occupation, and the destabilization of the Middle East would be felt for decades. What had begun as a mission to eliminate weapons of mass destruction and bring democracy to Iraq had instead unleashed a storm of chaos, one that no amount of firepower could fully contain. The opening hours of the Iraq War showcased the staggering might of the United States military in a display that seemed almost apocalyptic to those on the receiving end. The much-hyped shock and awe campaign, designed to psychologically cripple Iraq's defenses before ground troops even arrived in full force, began with over 1,700 air sorties in the first 24 hours alone. Hundreds of cruise missiles launched from U.S. warships in the Persian Gulf and Red Sea streaked across the sky, their trails barely visible before massive explosions consumed their targets. Precision-guided munitions, many dropped from B-2 stealth bombers flying all the way from Missouri, found their marks with chilling accuracy, obliterating government buildings, military installations, and suspected WMD sites across Baghdad, Basra, Mosul, and Tikrit. Embedded journalists traveling with coalition forces captured surreal images that quickly dominated television screens worldwide. Massive fireballs erupting from palaces, communication centers, and barracks, lighting up Baghdad's skyline like an infernal sunrise. While Western networks broadcast real-time footage of the bombardment, Iraqi state television responded with broadcasts of Saddam Hussein defiantly vowing resistance. He appeared seated at a desk, clutching a rifle, as he urged Iraqis to stand firm against the invading crusaders. But intelligence analysts scrutinizing the footage noticed inconsistencies. Some suggested these were pre-recorded messages, while others speculated that the man on screen wasn't Saddam at all, but a body double, a long-rumored tactic the Iraqi dictator allegedly used to evade assassination attempts. Nowhere was this more evident than in Nasiriyah, a strategic crossroads on the Euphrates River. The battle for the city, which raged from March 23rd to 29th, was far bloodier than anticipated. The U.S. Marines of Task Force Tarawa, expecting only minor resistance, found themselves engaged in a chaotic house-to-house fight as Fedayeen units and foreign jihadist fighters launched ambushes, sniper attacks, and suicide bombings against advancing U.S. forces. Roadside improvised explosive devices, IEDs, a tactic that would later define the entire war, made their first deadly appearances here. It was in Nasiriyah that one of the war's first major media events unfolded, the ambush of Army Private Jessica Lynch's unit. On March 23rd, a convoy from the 507th Maintenance Company, part of the U.S. Army's logistical support force, took a wrong turn in the city and blundered into enemy territory. What followed was a brutal ambush. Iraqi forces unleashed a barrage of gunfire and RPGs, knocking out multiple vehicles. 11 American soldiers were killed, several were wounded, and 5, including Lynch, were taken prisoner. As the air war unfolded, the coalition's ground invasion force of approximately 130,000 troops surged across the Kuwaiti border in a coordinated push toward Baghdad. Leading the charge was the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, supported by the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force and British forces advancing toward Basra. The plan was to conduct a rapid, mechanized assault, cutting through Iraq's conventional defenses with overwhelming speed. Pentagon strategists believed that once Saddam's army was confronted with the full force of American and British firepower, resistance would collapse within days. The reality proved more complicated. The much-vaunted Republican Guard, Saddam's elite fighting force, largely melted away rather than engaging in conventional battles. Many soldiers simply abandoned their posts, shedding their uniforms and blending into the civilian population, waiting for an opportunity to strike in the coming weeks as insurgents. But while regular Iraqi army units crumbled, unexpected and brutal resistance emerged from Saddam's Fedayeen militia. Fanatical, irregular fighters who relied on ambushes, suicide attacks, and guerrilla tactics rather than traditional battlefield engagements. Lynch, a 19-year old supply clerk, was badly injured in the attack and later moved to a hospital under Iraqi control. The Pentagon, eager for a morale-boosting story, seized upon her plight and presented her eventual rescue by U.S. Special Forces as a dramatic Hollywood-style operation, a daring nighttime raid by elite commandos who stormed the hospital under heavy fire, extracting Lynch from her captors in a blaze of gunfire. But as the days passed, contradictions in the official account began emerging. Subsequent investigations revealed that the actual rescue faced no real opposition. Iraqi doctors had already attempted to return Lynch to U.S. forces, but their approach was misunderstood. The Pentagon's narrative had exaggerated the danger, the firefight, and Lynch's own role in resisting capture. In later interviews, Lynch herself admitted she had never fired a shot and had been knocked unconscious early in the ambush. She became an unwitting symbol of the military's media manipulation. Her story transformed into propaganda, even as she struggled to recover from her injuries. Meanwhile, the war moved forward. The U.S. drive toward Baghdad continued with relentless speed, despite worsening conditions on the ground. The Fedayeen's suicide tactics and ambushes slowed progress, but U.S. commanders remained committed to the strategy of rapid maneuver warfare, bypassing major population centers whenever possible to prevent getting bogged down in prolonged urban combat. Cities like Najaf and Karbala witnessed sporadic engagements, but coalition forces largely pressed onward toward the capital. The Iraqi leadership, sensing the inevitable, attempted to maintain the illusion of control, but even loyalist forces were beginning to fracture. Republican Guard units positioned around Baghdad attempted last-ditch defenses, but many senior officers had already fled or gone into hiding. By early April, U.S. forces were closing in on the capital, and Saddam's government was unraveling. Despite the seemingly inevitable U.S. victory, warning signs were emerging that the war's real challenges lay ahead. The Iraqi army's disintegration meant that thousands of trained soldiers were now unaccounted for, many of whom would later become the backbone of an insurgency that would plague coalition forces for years to come. The chaotic battle in Nasiriyah, the manipulation of the Jessica Lynch story, and the unexpected ferocity of guerrilla resistance all pointed to a reality that the Pentagon had failed to anticipate. The war would not end with the fall of Baghdad. It was only just beginning. The rapid American advance toward Baghdad was a masterclass in maneuver warfare, a high-speed blitz designed to overwhelm what remained of Iraq's battered defenses before they could regroup. U.S. commanders, particularly General David McKiernan and General Tommy Franks, understood that speed and aggression were key. The 3rd Infantry Division and 1st Marine Expeditionary Force spearheaded the assault, their armored columns cutting through Iraq's central highway network like a dagger, bypassing strongholds whenever possible to avoid getting bogged down. By early April, U.S. forces were at Baghdad's doorstep, and the final push into the city came in the form of the now famous Thunder Runs of April 5th to 7th. These were not mere probing attacks, but full-force armored thrusts, designed to break the psychological and tactical backbone of Iraqi resistance. On April 5th, Task Force 164 Armor, led by Colonel David Perkins, launched the first Thunder Run, a deep penetration raid into Baghdad's southwestern districts. Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles roared down the highways, blasting through weak Iraqi defenses while speeding toward Saddam's key government installations. Entire Iraqi army units abandoned their positions rather than face the superior firepower of American armor. The second Thunder Run on April 7th was even more decisive. This time, a full mechanized brigade charged straight into the heart of Baghdad, smashing through whatever pockets of resistance remained. The Americans seized key intersections, military compounds, and bridges, effectively cutting off the city from the outside world. The sheer audacity and speed of the attack shattered the remnants of Iraqi morale. Units of the Republican Guard, once considered Saddam's elite troops, simply melted away, their soldiers discarding uniforms and weapons to blend into the civilian population. By April 9, 2003, U.S. forces had reached Firdos Square, the symbolic heart of Saddam's regime. Here, one of the war's most enduring and controversial images unfolded, the toppling of Saddam Hussein's statue, broadcast live to a global audience. To many watching from afar, this moment seemed to mark the triumphant end of the war, the final proof of America's victory. Yet, what few realized at the time was that this was no spontaneous uprising of jubilant Iraqis, but a carefully managed piece of military theater. A small group of Iraqis, many of them connected to Ahmad Chalabi's Iraqi National Congress, had been brought in to create the illusion of widespread celebration. U.S. Marines, seeking to stage a dramatic moment, wrapped a chain around the statue's neck and pulled it down using an M88 armored recovery vehicle. The carefully framed camera angles gave the impression of a massive citywide celebration. In reality, most of Baghdad's residents watched from their homes, wary and uncertain. They were not necessarily mourning Saddam's fall, but neither were they eager to embrace an unknown future under foreign occupation. But victory in Baghdad did not mean the war was over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The toppling of the statue may have been symbolic, but the real consequences of the invasion were unfolding in the streets, and they were far more chaotic than the Pentagon had anticipated. Within hours of Baghdad's fall, looting erupted across the city. Government offices, military bases, museums, hospitals, and even power plants were stripped bare as crowds of desperate civilians seized anything of value. Banks were ransacked, schools vandalized, and even Iraq's National Museum, home to priceless Mesopotamian artifacts, was pillaged, many of its treasures lost forever. The U.S. military, under orders to avoid direct interference in civilian affairs, stood by as the chaos spiraled out of control. "This is what freedom looks like," Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld quipped when pressed about the unfolding lawlessness. But the lack of immediate security was only the first of many disastrous decisions that would fuel the coming insurgency. Of all the missteps made in the early occupation, two stood out as particularly catastrophic: the disbanding of the Iraqi army and the de-Ba'athification of the government. These were known as Coalition Provisional Authority, CPA, Orders Number 1 and 2, issued by Paul Bremer, the newly appointed head of the U.S. occupation government. CPA Order Number 1, issued on May 16, 2003, effectively banned all former Ba'ath Party members from government positions, a move that purged tens of thousands of experienced civil servants, teachers, and bureaucrats from their jobs. While the intention was to root out Saddam loyalists, in practice, it left Iraq's institutions leaderless and dysfunctional. Even worse was CPA Order Number 2, issued on May 23, 2003, which disbanded the entire Iraqi army, a force of over 400,000 trained soldiers. Overnight, these men, many of them professional soldiers rather than Saddam loyalists, were left unemployed, humiliated, and armed with nothing to lose. With no severance pay, no reintegration program, and no alternative employment, tens of thousands of former soldiers turned to insurgency, militias, or criminal gangs. The U.S. had effectively created the perfect conditions for a prolonged guerrilla war. By the summer of 2003, signs of insurgency were already appearing. Attacks on U.S. patrols began escalating, first in the form of hit-and-run ambushes, then through roadside bombings and sniper attacks. The first IED, improvised explosive device, attacks started appearing in Baghdad and Fallujah, crude but deadly. What began as isolated incidents soon grew into an organized resistance movement. The former Ba'athists, now embittered and out of work, linked up with jihadist groups like Ansar al-Islam and foreign fighters inspired by al-Qaeda, creating a deadly hybrid insurgency. Meanwhile, Shiite militias, long suppressed under Saddam, began mobilizing with the help of Iran, further complicating the security situation. The U.S., unprepared for a long-term occupation and lacking a coherent post-invasion plan, found itself fighting a war it had not expected. The mission had officially been about WMDs, none of which were found. The regime change had been completed, but there was no clear vision for what came next. By the end of 2003, American forces in Iraq were no longer fighting a conventional enemy, but an amorphous, growing insurgency with multiple factions, shifting allegiances, and seemingly endless recruits. Every mistake made in the early months, from the failure to secure the country after Baghdad's fall to the reckless policies of de-Ba'athification and army disbandment, had set the stage for years of bloodshed. For those who had cheered the shock and awe campaign in March, the war had seemed like a swift and decisive victory. But for the Iraqis now caught in the chaos, and for the American soldiers who would spend years fighting an enemy that had no uniforms, no central command, and no intention of surrendering, the nightmare was only beginning. As the months dragged on and no weapons of mass destruction were found, the very foundation of the invasion began to crumble. What had been framed as a war of necessity increasingly looked like a war of choice, and with every passing day, the justification for the conflict grew weaker. American officials, scrambling to reframe the mission, pivoted toward a new narrative: nation-building. The focus shifted from disarming a dangerous dictator to transforming Iraq into a model democracy, a beacon of stability in the Middle East. But this was easier said than done. The reality on the ground was far more chaotic than the Bush administration had anticipated. Leading the transition was the Coalition Provisional Authority, CPA, a hastily assembled occupation government led by L. Paul Bremer, a career diplomat with little experience in Middle Eastern affairs. From his office in the heavily fortified Green Zone in Baghdad, Bremer wielded near-total authority over Iraq's reconstruction. But his tenure was marked by a series of disastrous miscalculations. The decisions to dissolve the Iraqi army and purge the government of Ba'ath Party members meant to rid Iraq of Saddam's influence, instead fueled mass unemployment and resentment, pushing thousands of angry armed men into the ranks of the insurgency. By the summer of 2003, violence was spiraling out of control. Sunni insurgents, many of them former Iraqi military officers and intelligence operatives, began organizing attacks against American forces in places like Fallujah, Ramadi, and Tikrit. These fighters, motivated by a mix of nationalism, revenge, and religious extremism, started using improvised explosive devices, IEDs, ambushes, and sniper attacks to inflict casualties on coalition troops. At the same time, a new and even deadlier force was emerging in Iraq: the foreign jihadists. Among them was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a Jordanian militant with a brutal reputation who had long dreamed of turning Iraq into the heart of an Islamic caliphate. Operating under the radar at first, Zarqawi and his followers began launching suicide bombings and assassinations, targeting both U.S. forces and Shiite civilians. Over time, his group would evolve into Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, the precursor to ISIS. While the Sunni insurgency raged in central and western Iraq, a separate power struggle was unfolding in the south. Iraq's Shiite majority, long oppressed under Saddam, was no longer willing to remain on the sidelines. Radical Shiite clerics, particularly Muqtada al-Sadr, began forming militias to challenge both coalition forces and rival Shiite factions. Backed covertly by Iran, groups like the Mahdi Army and the Badr Brigade began asserting control over Shiite strongholds like Najaf, Karbala, and Baghdad's Sadr city. The U.S. occupation now faced enemies on multiple fronts: an entrenched Sunni insurgency, an emerging Shiite resistance, and the growing threat of jihadist extremism. American forces, spread thin and struggling to adapt, found themselves caught in an increasingly deadly cycle of raids, counter-raids, and retaliatory attacks. Then came Operation Red Dawn. On December 13, 2003, after months of intelligence gathering and interrogations, U.S. Special Forces finally captured Saddam Hussein. The once feared dictator was found hiding in a tiny underground hole near Tikrit, disheveled, weak, and unarmed. His capture was a symbolic victory for the U.S., hailed as a turning point that would break the back of the insurgency, but this belief proved wildly optimistic. Instead of collapsing, the insurgency intensified. With Saddam gone, Sunni rebels no longer had any reason to hold back, and the power vacuum left by his regime's fall only deepened Iraq's chaos. If 2003 had been the year of invasion and occupation, 2004 was the year of all-out rebellion. The first major flashpoint came in Fallujah, the heart of the Sunni insurgency. After a group of American contractors from Blackwater, USA were ambushed, killed, and their bodies burned and hung from a bridge, the U.S. launched Operation Vigilant Resolve, a full-scale assault to retake the city. But the attack, rushed and poorly planned, faced fierce resistance from insurgents who had spent months preparing booby traps, sniper nests, and defensive positions. Thousands of civilians were caught in the crossfire, and images of bombed-out neighborhoods and dead women and children turned Fallujah into a rallying cry for anti-American resistance. The operation ultimately failed, forcing U.S. forces to withdraw and regroup. Meanwhile, the Shiite uprising was erupting in the south. In April 2004, Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army launched a full-scale rebellion, seizing control of Najaf, Kufa, and parts of Baghdad. American forces, already stretched thin fighting Sunni insurgents, were now forced to battle an entirely separate enemy. Weeks of brutal urban combat followed, with street-to-street fighting, airstrikes, and mass arrests. Sadr's fighters, though ultimately driven back, had proven they could challenge the most powerful military in the world and survive. As the twin uprisings unfolded, another crisis shattered America's credibility: the Abu Ghraib scandal. In late April 2004, shocking photographs emerged showing U.S. soldiers torturing, humiliating, and abusing Iraqi prisoners at the infamous Abu Ghraib prison. The images, naked detainees stacked in pyramids, prisoners being menaced by attack dogs, and hooded men subjected to mock executions, sparked global outrage. The Bush administration claimed it was an isolated incident, but for many Iraqis, it confirmed their worst fears about the American occupation. The damage to America's reputation was irreversible. Whatever moral high ground the U.S. had once claimed was now gone. As 2004 dragged on, the CPA, realizing it could not govern Iraq indefinitely, began preparing for the transfer of power. But the process was anything but smooth. The Iraqi Governing Council, IGC, a hand-picked body of exiles and technocrats, proved hopelessly divided and ineffective. Meanwhile, Iraq's factions were already maneuvering for dominance, with Sunnis, Shiites, and Kurds each demanding more power and resources. The first democratic elections, held in January 2005, were meant to legitimize the new Iraqi government, but instead, they deepened Iraq's sectarian divides. The Sunnis, feeling alienated from the new order, boycotted the elections, allowing the Shiite parties to dominate the new parliament. The result was a government that Sunnis saw as illegitimate, fueling even greater resentment and insurgent violence. By early 2005, Iraq was no closer to stability than it had been in 2003. The war had morphed into a complex multi-front conflict, with American troops caught in the middle. Sunni insurgents, Shiite militias, and foreign jihadists were all vying for power, and nation-building had become an afterthought. What had started as a quick invasion to remove a dictator had turned into a quagmire of bloodshed, political chaos, and rising extremism. A war America could not easily win, but could not afford to lose. The U.S. troop surge of 2007 to 2008, combined with the Sunni awakening movement, temporarily brought violence under control, but it was a band-aid solution rather than a true resolution. The additional 30,000 U.S. troops deployed under President George W. Bush's surge strategy helped suppress sectarian violence, allowing the U.S. military to conduct more aggressive counterinsurgency operations. Meanwhile, Sunni tribal leaders, disillusioned with al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, turned against the jihadists in what became known as the Sunni Awakening. With U.S. support, thousands of former insurgents were recruited into local security forces, dramatically weakening AQI's influence. However, the underlying sectarian tensions remained unresolved. The surge reduced violence, but it did not eliminate the political and religious divides tearing Iraq apart. By 2009, with violence at its lowest level since the war began, American political will to continue the occupation was fading. In 2010, Iraq held parliamentary elections, resulting in a fractured government with no single party able to claim a decisive victory. Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, a Shiite hardliner, secured a second term through backroom political maneuvering and Iranian influence, sidelining Sunni politicians and further alienating Iraq's Sunni population. As part of the U.S.-Iraq Status of Forces Agreement, SOFA, signed in 2008, American combat troops were required to withdraw by the end of 2011. President Barack Obama, fulfilling a key campaign promise, ended the U.S. military presence in Iraq on December 18, 2011. The withdrawal was celebrated by many Americans, exhausted by nearly a decade of war, but it left behind an unstable Iraq, still plagued by sectarian strife, corruption, and power struggles. The situation in Iraq rapidly deteriorated after the U.S. departure. Maliki's government, instead of fostering reconciliation, pursued a campaign of persecution against Sunni leaders, arresting politicians and dismantling the Sunni awakening groups that had helped defeat AQI. Thousands of former Sunni fighters, abandoned by the government and facing marginalization and repression, became easy recruits for the next wave of jihadist insurgency. Out of the remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq, a far more brutal and ambitious group emerged, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. Led by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, ISIS capitalized on Sunni resentment, launching a series of bold attacks against Iraqi security forces. By 2014, ISIS had overrun Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city, and declared a caliphate, controlling vast swaths of Iraq and Syria. The very insurgency the U.S. had spent billions to suppress had returned stronger and deadlier than ever. The human cost of the Iraq War was staggering. Over 4,500 U.S. service members were killed, with tens of thousands wounded, many suffering lifelong physical and psychological scars. For Iraqis, the toll was far worse. Estimates of civilian deaths range from 200,000 to over 1 million, depending on the source. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, and millions of Iraqis were displaced. Families were torn apart by sectarian violence, and an entire generation grew up knowing nothing but war, occupation, and insurgency. The financial cost was equally staggering. The war, initially promised to be swift and inexpensive, ended up costing over $2 trillion, with trillions more expected in future costs for veterans' health care and interest on war debt. The reconstruction of Iraq, once projected to be funded by Iraqi oil revenues, turned into a bottomless pit of corruption and mismanagement. Perhaps the most damning failure of all was the complete absence of weapons of mass destruction, the very justification for war. Despite years of exhaustive searches, no stockpiles of chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons were ever found. The Bush administration's case for war was built on faulty intelligence, exaggerated claims, and political pressure. What had been sold as a preventative war against a grave threat ultimately became a cautionary tale of military overreach, ideological hubris, and unintended consequences. 2 decades later, the Iraq War remains one of the most controversial conflicts in American history. It shattered U.S. credibility on the global stage, exposed the flaws of interventionist foreign policy, and destabilized an entire region. Instead of creating a beacon of democracy, the war empowered Iran, deepened sectarian divides, and gave birth to the most dangerous jihadist group of the 21st century. The legacy of Iraq is one of miscalculation, devastation, and long-lasting repercussions that continue to shape American foreign policy to this day.